But still talking about power, I wanted to pick up your brain on quantum computing. So it's kind of like a big topic at the moment, and all the concern about the ability of quantum to break traditional encryption, and what is your take on quantum computing?
Well, this thing happens. So, we first had mechanical analog computers, and then they were called difference engines, and they built them in the 19th and 20th century. And then the dawn of the vacuum tube came out, and then we had vacuum tube computers for about 2 decades. And then at Bell Labs, they created the transistor, and they said, wow, these transistors are amazing. And basically, they created the modern day computer, and so the von Neumann architecture. And that was kind of brought out to the mainstream. So for a very large class of problems, these computers can do computation efficiently and solve all kinds of things. The problem is there's a whole bunch of problems that these computers really can't work on. For example, the factoring large integers, which is where RSA is secure. So that's used for cryptography, the same for the discrete log problem, and so forth. Okay, well, when your model of computation is not so good, what you do is you go look for another one. And it turns out in quantum physics, there's some crazy things you can do. And these magic crazy things you can do basically allow you to work on problems that normal computers cannot solve in any amount of time. Like, you take all the time in the universe to solve, and they somehow can solve these problems in a reasonable amount of time, reasonable being like minutes to hours to days. So suddenly, not only encryption becomes tractable to break for a lot of traditional cryptography systems, but also you have a whole bunch of problems that would be really useful in medicine and really useful in supply chain management, and even everyday things like airline routing. For example, trying to make decisions of how to route multiple people to through different countries and different airports. When you scale that out to millions of people, it actually is a very difficult problem, and we can never really get a perfect approximation. With quantum computers, you may actually be able to solve those types of problems in real time. So this is really magical, and there's a huge market incentive for people to chase it. But it does mean that you have to kind of change your model when it becomes prominent. So, for example, the Enigma machine back in the 1940s that the Nazis used to encrypt their messages was nearly unbreakable when humans were trying to decrypt it. But when Alan Turing built the bomb at Bletchley Park, a computer, the Enigma machine was now breakable. So when you invent a new computational model, generally speaking, you usually break the cryptography that was designed for the past. Well, similarly, the crypto designed for today will not survive very well under a quantum computer. The good news is cryptographers are super smart, and they've kind of known about this for a long time. And what they're doing is they're building a whole new class of cryptography. And there's many different approaches: hash-based crypto, lattice-based crypto, learning with error, all super singular isogenies with elliptic curves. And each and every one of these has a trade-off profile, but basically there's no known quantum algorithm that can solve them, meaning that they'll be secure even if a quantum computer is there. So what we've done at IOHK is we started some foundational research where we're trying to get an understanding of what would a quantum adversary look like. So that's basically saying, okay, imagine a boogeyman who owns a quantum computer, maybe the NSA or DARPA or IBM or Google. What could they do to our protocols, from our proof of stake protocol to how we handle signatures to other things like zero knowledge proofs and so forth. And what we're doing is proactively developing protocols that are quantum resistant, which means that there's no known reduction that allows them to be solved on a quantum computer. The big issue here right now is optimization. So while it's possible to make your protocols resistant to a quantum computer, the issue is that it just simply lowers your performance and increases the amount of data on chain dramatically, in some cases by a factor of 10 to 100. So a signature that would normally be a kilobyte can end up being 10 kilobytes or 100 kilobytes. So that's like a 10x to 100x degradation in performance for your system. So the big challenge for us is, how do we make our systems quantum resistant, but at the same time make the systems capable of being performant and scaling? And that's something we're working on and a lot of other people are working on. But the good news is that this is a huge collective problem, and thousands of cryptographers all around the world are meeting regularly. and developing protocols very regularly, like the Crystals framework and the NIST effort to standardize a post-quantum suite. And we see a lot of great solutions and ideas floating around. So we'll get it done, probably not in the 2020 time horizon. We'll do some things to probably make our system a little bit secure against that. But that's probably in the next 3 years to 5 years, we'll be able to actually develop that protocol suite and harden them. Now, in terms of when quantum computers are going to come, Google recently announced that they made a major breakthrough. But to be realistic, I'd say we won't see these things in the hands of governments or large corporations for another 10 to 20 years. Because there's just so many moving pieces, from reliability to fidelity of computation to the error correction side and so forth. But if you're particularly curious about it, or anybody's curious about it, probably the best conference to go to is crypto. They have it every year at Santa Barbara. And actually the head of Google's quantum computing group usually presents at crypto because he's a professor at University of California at Santa Barbara. And that's where they hold the conference at. So it's kind of like a bellwether where, I go every year and I get to talk to them and say, hey, how's Google doing this year? Where are you guys at? And you can kind of see the progress year by year. And Google has a pretty good finger on the pulse of all their competitors, IBM and Microsoft and the rest of the companies that are pursuing quantum computation. And it's really amazing to see how much progress has been made, but there's still another good 10 to 20 years, I'd say, before we see something that would even be close to retail or even large corporation. So I don't think we have much to worry about today.
No, exactly. And also, I think this evolution of quantum has been kind of driven by security services and governments so far. So it's kind of like unknown at the moment where they are. But definitely a very interesting conference to look and attend. And that will be next year in Santa Barbara.
Yeah, every year they do. They've been doing it for about 30 years. It's an academic conference. It's actually considered to be the top cryptography conference in the United States. It's the hardest one to get your papers into. They only accept about 10 to 20% of the papers submitted. And it's a big gathering of scientists. But these happen to be the scientists who care the most about quantum computers. So they always have dedicated sessions on what can quantum computers do and what type of crypto can be broken, and et cetera, et cetera. And actually, even besides quantum computers, there's been an enormous amount of evolution and the development of ASICs to actually break RSA. For example, there was a paper from Lenstra using a general number thief that broke a 768-bit key about 10 years ago. So the 1 kilobit keys are probably vulnerable today. So there's all kinds of things like index calculus and so forth that can be used to actually break normal crypto, and that does not require a quantum computer. So it's always a game of cat and mouse. If you make assumptions about how hard things are, people are going to work really, really hard to build specialized computers and algorithms to try to short circuit that a little bit. And so you have to enter into this with the presumption that nothing is permanent.
Exactly. This is your point about evolution. Now, what I would like to focus on a little bit in this from now is about, the Cardano for social goods and all the great projects that you have been working on, from Ethiopia to your partnership with the footwear manufacturer New Balance, and the way that you're basically trying to apply Cardano to different projects to improve the supply chain, to basically make things better.
Right.
So, which is basically, I understand, the mission of Cardano, isn't it?
Yeah, we've always viewed Cardano kind of like a social operating system. I originally said a financial operating system. And I said, well, you can do non-financial things with it. And at the end of the day, really all it's about is managing assets, information, and identity. And it's a transaction system. And so when you start really thinking about what does that actually mean, it touches literally everything in an economy. From the choices you make, for example, who should be in charge, or basically what do I believe in, or what should national policy be for something like global warming, all the way to the management of your personal finances. All of these things touch what a blockchain can do. So when you look at the difference between the developing world and the developed world, the key difference isn't the people. The people are just as smart, just as capable, in many cases more passionate in the developing world because they face far more peril and risk. The difference are the social systems that they have. So how their government works. For example, I was in Ethiopia not too long ago, and just getting a SIM card for my phone took days because of the bureaucracy, and it's just because there's one monopoly and so forth. I was in Ireland not too long ago, and it was really hard to get a cab because of the way that they kind of pushed out Uber, and everything is regulated and controlled. So this is like bad systems create poverty, or bad systems make it hard for people to rise up and reduce social mobility. So when you view Cardano and say this thing's a social operating system, what you're basically saying is you can throw away the whole legacy system and let's just build a new one. And let's start with fundamental interactions. And always the first interactions are economic. So business, making money, commercial stuff. But then once you trust the system for that, then you start saying, well, why can't I put property on this? Well, why can't I put my house deed on this? And then we can just put metadata around it. And then people start saying, well, what other interaction? Maybe I can put a social network on top of this. And then they say, well, why can't I put a voting system on top of this? And we can use it to decide who's in charge of our club, or use it to decide who's in charge of our company. And then eventually people say, well, why can't we run a national election on this type of a system? Well, and so there's this great compositionality when you start looking at it. So we love the developing world because they know they have to compete, and change is being forced upon them. Like one great example would be in Ethiopia. Let's say you're a coffee grower. Now, they've been growing coffee the same way for a very, very long time. The Italians tried to change it a little bit when they came in, but besides that, that's just basically all it is.
Try the Italians.
Yeah. They've been growing coffee the same way for a long time. And so then all of a sudden Starbucks comes in and says, hey, look, we're not going to buy coffee from you guys unless you prove you're environmentally sustainable and it's fair trade and that you're paying your workers properly. Well, how do you do that if you're low tech, you don't even have paperwork, people are not digitized, they don't have cell phones? How do you actually prove that they're following sustainable farming practices and using sustainable fertilizer, and that they're paying their workers fairly and so forth? So you need a completely new system from the ground up. And if they decide not to do that, well, then they lose market access to Starbucks.
I know, but Charles, wait a second. That comes the problem of education. So how are you going to educate those people to implement this system in countries such as Ethiopia?
Yeah. So this is where doing collective problem solving is how you change the world. So if it was just IOHK and Cardano, it would be an intractable problem. We couldn't do it. But the fact is that this is now a problem where the government has to figure out a solution, or else their economy goes down 30% and they lose more and more customers against Indonesia and other governments. So there's direct investment from the government. There's direct foreign investment. In many cases, there's private investment from corporations and aid organizations to do exactly that: educate people, build infrastructure, build cell phone infrastructure, create new supply chains. For example, there's a $50 million program right now that the Prime Minister's office is pushing out specifically for digital identity. There's a dedicated organization in Ethiopia called the ATA, the Agricultural Transformation Organization, that's putting all the farmers into large groups called ACCs, Agricultural Commercialization Clusters, and this specifically so that they can collectively bargain and they can collectively manage these farmers. So the fact that these things exist means that we can plug into them and then put a blockchain solution on top of it. So it's more about strategic alliances and partnerships than it is about, well, can we just do everything from the ground up? It's almost like Tesla, to use an analogy. If Tesla had to be a battery company and invent all the battery technology and figure out how to make great batteries, Tesla would fail. The reality is Tesla's standing on the shoulders of Apple and everybody else that's building mobile devices. Because we as consumers, we want cell phones that charge really quickly. We want cell phones that last a long time, that are very light and thin, and that the batteries don't wear out. Well, so that means billions and billions of dollars of R&D is going in every year for these consumer electronic devices that Tesla gets for free, because all that output basically goes into their R&D queue. And so similarly, you have this huge shift of globalization in the developing world, and all the old social systems that these countries have are going to have to be changed, whether they like it or not. So there's enormous direct foreign investment to change them, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to come in and propose something different, because they can either put in the old system, the American system or the European system, or they can go in a completely different direction for everything, from how their regulations work to how their citizen identities work and so forth. And we have an analogy for that. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Europe had to make a decision. Do we go with an old bureaucratic system, or do we actually go with much more modern systems? And so we saw in Georgia and Estonia and a lot of these other countries an embracing of modern systems. And it's no coincidence that you can now vote online in Estonia. And in Georgia, they actually are already using blockchain systems for a lot of their government services, and we're actually working with them to build some more. So I think that's really the key, is to ride the right trend, make sure that you're working with an alliance or many partners, make sure that there's forcing factors that force them to consume new things, and then give them the leapfrog argument of saying, look, go with the modern new thing, don't go with the legacy thing, because then you'll have a competitive advantage on the Western world, and you can leverage that to build wealth for everybody. And so far, going with this strategy, we've been very successful. We've been able to talk to lots of world leaders. We've been able to talk to a lot of government agencies, and there's certainly ample funding to be able to pursue this. The downside is it does take time. A lot of these projects are in the 3 to 7 year time horizon. So, in the cryptocurrency space, we tend to live in days or weeks. We don't tend to look even at months. And then when I'm saying, hey guys, it's going to be like 3 years to 7 years, people get very impatient. But that's just, how it works in Africa and how it works in Eastern Europe and so forth.
I think this is how it works everywhere. For example, even I thought that the partnership that you did with New Balance was great, because actually, the fashion industry, similar to the food industry in a way, they have got the kind of disruption or level of untrust in the supply chain, which need to be fixed for the customers. They want better food. They want to check the quality where these things come from. I mean, in Italy, my dad he has a dairy farm, and he used to make lots of money in the 80s selling milk. It was high quality milk and all these things. Then you got China now coming and bringing cheap milk, and you never know whether, even if you buy high quality milk, it might be milk from China, and that's why all the farmers in Italy, they don't get paid anymore. I mean, the revenues, they went down a lot, and I think this kind of trust in the supplier, fighting counterfeiting faction, for example, the quality of the material is really important. That's where Cardano is really, I think, is looking a very interesting sector, very interesting point as well.
Yeah, let's talk about fashion for a second. As a consumer of luxury fashion goods, I've spent a lot of money on purses and other things like that. I can assure you that this is an industry.
I can see some similarity, but
yeah, this is an industry that definitely needs some innovation. For example, Chanel, if you go to their website, they will not authenticate their products. So you can have a Chanel bag and be like, hey, is this Chanel or not? And the company will say, oh, sorry, we can't tell you. Which is just crazy. You spend all this money on something and you can't go into a store and they won't tell you what's real and what's not real. And that's just a very basic thing. So, there's kind of like two levels to authentication when you're talking about a luxury good. One is the good real or not, and how was the good manufactured? And then the other are, what are the consequences of being part of that community? Because when you buy a luxury good, you're not just holding a luxury good, you're part of a group of people that happen to own that, whether that be Rolex or Vacheron Constantin or Lamborghini or a Christian Dior purse. You're now part of something. So the management of authentication and the management of those communities is fragmented, and it's incredibly unwieldy, and it's also very siloed. So even if you can do it well, let's say in Japan, you'll get a completely different experience in South Korea or China or the United States. So the power of blockchain is that it's kind of a universal thing. The companies couldn't care less about controlling the infrastructure that manages all of this. What they care about is controlling their customers and being able to continue maintaining those relationships and having those customers come back year after year. And they have mutual incentives to prevent counterfeiting, because counterfeiting dilutes their brand value, right? For example, Rolex, if you see a Rolex 9 out of 10 times, it's a fake. It's not a real watch. So blockchain, right?
And this is also a problem. It's not just when you go and buy the real Rolex, it's also when you go to the second-hand market and you try, you buy a Chanel bag, and then you see that after a month it's kind of, you have to throw it away. So that was not a real Chanel bag, or they sell it as a real Chanel bag. So I think this is kind of also things, because if a fashion item may become a digital asset, then you're going to be able to sell it, trade it, and he has got proof, he has got an identity, and that's, I think, is really important. You know, there are, I mean, I'm Italian, so there are a lot of fakes that has been done in Italy, south of Italy and stuff, you know, with Gucci scarf or whatever. So it's really, really a big problem.
Oh, it's a huge problem, and it's actually $1 trillion marketplace when you actually sum up the entire cost of a lack of brand protection. And you're absolutely right about the secondary market. It's something that we're really keen and excited to look into, because at the end of the day, if I want to go online and buy a watch, for example, when I look at something, I say, oh, well, that's a great deal for that Frederick Constant or that Vacheron Constantin, but I don't know if it's real or not. So the seller of that watch pays the price for that, where basically there's going to be built into the price of it a reduction of price because of counterfeit risk. But if they could absolutely prove beyond a reason of a doubt that what they're selling is real, and I can verify that myself as the consumer, then they can charge much higher prices. So it's and then the other thing is actually having the manufacturer be able to be part of that sale for the secondary market. Let's say, for example, you want to resell your Chanel purse. Maybe you can actually get Chanel to certify that it's real, and they can sign that transaction. Then they can get a commission on it. So as Chanel, you actually get to make money on your secondary market, and that's never been the case ever in luxury goods. So
Exactly, and now what you do, for example, you can go on Vester Collective or any other website, and what they do, they take like a week or 4 or 5 days, which they said this time is basically where a human person, right? A human can always make a mistake. Is going to verify the item, and that's the current process that is happening at the moment. Where, as you said, if Chanel verify your transaction and that is kind of put on a blockchain, that is something there tangible that anybody can contest,
Right. And if it's consumer verifiable, that's just so much better, because not only is it verifiable, is it real or not, then you can start putting metadata. For example, what if the purse or the luxury item happened to belong to a very famous person?
Exactly, because it get even more valuable, because maybe the bag was from Naomi Campbell, let's say, so maybe I really want it. That's really true.
And be able to build a global infrastructure for that, it's actually not that hard to do with blockchain, and it's easy to upsell these things to these manufacturers. So we were super excited to work with New Balance. It was a pilot, and it was just kind of our first dip into the authentication market, and we said, wow, this is really cool. And we're definitely going to double down on it and get heavily involved in it. And Cardano's a great platform for this, because we're building Cardano to deal with regulated products like security tokens and these things, which means that all that infrastructure you build to authenticate people can be basically reused wholesale for luxury goods. And what you do is just issue tokens and make them match the good. So if you do a production line of like a 5,000 purses, you create 5,000 tokens, and then you have a different division of the company control those tokens, and then they do self-authentication within the company, and then they pair the tokens to the product. So it actually not only can prevent counterfeiting on the aftermarket, it actually can prevent counterfeiting within the supply chain itself. For example, there's this big problem with third shift runs, where let's say the first 2 shifts you're making legitimate Gucci purses, and then the workers kind of stick around at night, with the Cosa Nostra, and they make a third round in the same factory with the same materials to create counterfeit Guccis. Well, even if they did that with this type of a system, those purses would never be authenticatable, because the tokens are actually stored separately in a different division.
Exactly, and this is the same, with diamonds and gems, and sometimes you send maybe you lose a diamond, you send it to a place, and then they put a Swarovski, and they sell it like or a zircon, and they say that is a diamond. Anyway, this is super, super exciting. It really gets me on.